Hello, and welcome to the panel on ethical leadership and decision-making in the age of artificial intelligence, AI. I'm very excited to be chairing this session because I think it's going to be so interesting. I'm Joy McKnight. I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm also the former editor of The Banker, which is part of the Financial Times Group. And I have three great panelists with me today, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. Giles, can I start with you?
I'm Giles Cuthbert. I'm Managing Director at Chartered Banker Institute, and as well as having spent many years working with banks around their professional development, I've also recently completed a doctorate in artificial intelligence ethics. Thank you.
Fantastic. Paul, can I get you to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, good morning, Joy. Hello, it's wonderful to be here. Paul Donga. I'm head of responsible AI and AI strategy at NatWest Banking Group, where I work pan-bank with teams on implementing ethical AI practices. I've been involved in IT in banking for 25 years, and prior to that, I was an academic, and I have a PhD in AI and used to teach AI many years ago.
Fantastic. And Hissam.
Good morning, everyone. This is Hissam Sultan, Head of ESG Solutions at Santander UK Corporate and Commercial Banking. Before that, I spent some time with S&P Global as Head of ESG Solutions for Middle East, Africa, and India. And before that, I was in Southeast Asia. So I have the advantage of working in multiple jurisdictions and markets, dealing mainly in commercial banking and sustainable and green banking.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me. When we think about optimizing banking in the digital age, the advent of AI, which has been really turbocharged, I think, by generative AI and the use of large language models, presents a great opportunities for the banking industry as a whole. And it's fueled by the 3 V's of big data: velocity, volume, and variety. AI tools are being used across the bank, from the customer front end to deep in the back office. But I think AI deployment also comes with significant challenges, including ethical issues such as bias and fairness, accountability and governance, transparency and explainability, privacy and data security, and the impact on employment and workforce dynamics. So understanding and navigating these complex ethical concerns is an area that banks and other financial institutions are grappling with. And I think leaders need to implement really strict ethical guidelines. They need to continuously monitor the impact of AI decisions and ensure that human-centered approach in areas affecting individuals and society. In 2019, I wrote a feature for The Banker on devising an ethical framework for the AI age, which looked at where AI was being deployed successfully in the banks, as well as the ethical concerns being raised at the time, and how banks and regulators were working together to develop guidelines or principles for the responsible use of AI. And I cited FEAT, which is the framework that was put together by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And at that time, they were really at the forefront of developing that kind of guidelines or framework for that. And I think while AI has really come a long way since then, the question of ethics is even more pressing as the technology is taking over much more of the workflow within the banks. So I'm going to kick off the discussion, and my first question is going to be to Hissam. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges leaders in the area face when trying to build that responsible and ethical banking culture, amid this rapid technological advances that we're seeing today?
Thank you very much, Joy. This is a very good question. I mean, in different markets, the challenges are different, of course. You'd be surprised that in some markets, they're still grappling with the old archaic systems. They're still trying to figure out what is the best digital solution. They haven't gone to that level where AI is deployed. I mean, this is not just in third world countries or in developing markets, but even in some cases in developed markets. So the issue there on use of AI is, somehow is over exaggerated. Yes, it's a very useful tool. Yes, it's a very good tool that will help in speed up decision making in terms of processing, in terms of cutting time. but the human element is still very, very, very crucial there.
Mm.
Imagine taking a decision without accountability, taking a decision without knowing who is there taking that. Is it who do you go to if you want to question further? The coder, the programmer, the board of directors, the chief executives, or the regulator?
Mm.
Who's in charge? And that's I think is a big question. Sometimes maybe it's a convenient way of hiding behind AI or new technology, but sometimes it's balancing those priorities. Banks are faced with serious issues when it comes to the main element of AI, which is data.
Mm.
In some markets, the data is absent. You cannot get those data even in paper format. You don't know some of the old clients where their turnover was 10 years ago or 5 years ago or now. You don't know some of the basic ingredients of processing information. So these are some of the challenges that are faced. Is the infrastructure. It's not the same in different markets. Regulation is not the same in different markets. The expectations of customers is not the same. In some markets, customers are, they have high standards, they have high expectations. And in other markets, the customers may not even want some of these ethical solutions. I remember having these discussions with small businesses, SMEs in Malaysia and also in Egypt. And some of them are saying, we don't want this. I mean, why are you imposing TCFD, for example, on us when we have other priorities? So balancing those priorities, how would a banker or a senior executive in a bank design their products? Do they take into account the feedback from those customers? Some of these customers, they'll say, I don't want this. I have basic needs. I want credit. I want a trade line, for example.
Mm.
But in some cases, these are kind of necessary and very useful when it comes to processing certain complex operations. They may save cost. For example, if you take scenario analysis for climate, very complex operations, very detailed, very, takes a lot of data points and processing them and assessing the risk. That could be a very useful tool, kind of like a calculator, if you wish. But it's not a replacement for the human element in making those decisions. Some of the challenges also including marketing challenges. How do you market ethical banking products? Can you commodify ethics? Does it become a question of philosophy? I mean, how does a bank define ethics and ethical products? Do they let AI decide what that means, or do they let the regulator decide what that means, or do they let the consumer and the customer decide what that is? How do you capture that and assess it objectively without impacting, other regulations like greenwashing regulation or anti-competition or transparency? And so these are some of the challenges executives and leaders are facing. There are conflicting priorities, negative perception of banks, that they are there in order to increase the level of indebtedness in society, and there is a skills gap. Some of these issues are real. How do you get talent and retaining those talents and getting them developing even further? So some of these challenges are different in different markets. In some markets, you'll have millions of graduates of engineering and software engineering and programming. And in other markets, this is a scarcity. This is something that banks face real issues. Can AI replace all that? Maybe. But then it comes with other issues.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And I think you've touched on so many challenges there. But Paul, I was also going to ask you, in terms of that culture, that responsible and ethical banking culture, what are you doing to address that with the organizations that you've worked in?
I think really at the heart of this lies sort of culture. So it's adopting within the organization a data and ethics culture, which is all around training people and making them aware that actually the data they handle and manage actually is sensitive. The data lineage, its integrity and how it's used is really important. So I think there's a Handbank sort of cultural awareness and training that we're embarking on. And we have a number of different training courses and training material and even kind of little qualifications you can take to ensure that that is something that's adopted across teams. For leaders as well, we have training, comms and awareness to really uplift the importance of them understanding how to drive this into their teams. So I think culture combined with training and awareness is really important. And also driving inclusivity and diversity. So that's ensuring that development teams are not only inclusive and diverse in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of thought and cultural aspects. So diversity of thought is actually really important as well. So those are just the two of the ways that we do it. But they require constant effort, and the benefits of that emerge over time. Sometimes hard to quantify, but the benefits are huge when we get it right.
And I guess the thing is, this is independent of what technology is coming through, right? You always want to be having that cultural, lightning rod, I guess, to actually make sure that everything that the institution is doing aligns ethically with society,
Exactly.
what it's trying to achieve. And so, Giles, I was going to ask the same question to you, but maybe take it into, what are the main ethical concerns that you see when implementing specifically AI technologies in banking?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, well, I think it was really interesting following some of those thoughts around culture, because I mean, starting at it outside the world of AI, first of all, I think that every decision we take is ethical. The question is it a difficult question which requires further consideration? Most of the considerations we have in our life, we're not ethically challenged by them. We go ahead and do them. But I think it's a good starting point to remember that there is an element of ethics about what we choose not to do and what we choose to do in every activity, and therefore that flows through your culture. For me, I think, and I was writing about this recently, the problems we're faced or challenges we're faced with AI aren't actually terribly different from what we're faced in the real world. There's much being made of, oh, AI ethics is different, it's a whole new world. But then we talk about data. Every banker knows that data is something you've protected for the last 100, 150 years. We talk about honesty, we talk about responsibility. These aren't new concepts to us, but what AI does is it's, with the speed, the scale, etc., it amplifies those challenges that we have. So I think we have to be very careful not to think that these are impossibly difficult challenges that we're facing. They are the same challenges we face. But I think what really fascinates me is the extent to which sometimes it's not central to considerations. And a good example I'll give is chatbots when used by organizations. If a human talked to a customer in the way a chatbot does, for example, ignoring their question and just giving them some random information, it's not random, I know, that they have, that human wouldn't stay working in a bank branch very long. But it's a chatbot, and we feel it's okay to present that to customers. So I think there's a really interesting question around what we allow to happen in the digital world that I think all of us would be in agreement in the real world wouldn't be right. And we see this, and that's just a small example I use there, but we see this with banks, sorry, not with banks, I meant to say, we see this in a whole lot of different areas. And then you consider, we get this, oh, it's coming, it's the future, you've got to deal with it. Well, we wouldn't accept that with medical technology. So why do we accept it with technology in other areas that we shouldn't have fully tested, fully responsible AI? And I've got to say at this point, I'm not talking specifically about banks, because I know banks are very responsible and honest and full of integrity in their activities. But the challenge is we're always presented with this, it's coming, you've got to deal with it, rather than it's coming, we've got to justify it to you, the bank, the customer, the client, etc., etc. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic there that happens. And I also think the hype is one of the big challenges we face. You know, I recall, but I don't recall because it was before I was born. We were told all our jobs would be replaced by AI by 1972. We were told we'd all have self-driving cars by 2018 or 2019. So there's this culture of acceptance that I think we have to modify as professionals and professional bankers to a culture of challenge, of knowledge, understanding, responsibility, and challenging what we see. Because these aren't new challenges, as I say, in terms of ethics. They tend to be quite old in their nature. So we need to bring those values that we've always had as professionals to the game here, rather than accepting what's happening. Because I think that does happen with a lot of technology. We see it coming along, you know, whether that's an mechanical skateboard or whatever, and we accept it and we wait for the regulator to act. My view would be we should act on the basis of our ethics before the regulator acts. And just one last point on that, that is something you quite regularly hear. Oh, the regulator's got to do something. Well, actually, as ethical professionals, we should be acting first.
And those are really interesting points that you've made there. And I guess, like, as you said, it's sort of that the scale of how fast things are moving, but also the potential of things that could go wrong as well, right? So I just think about the potential risks of, let's say, bias in historical data, for example, and then which can lead to discrimination. So, Paul, the next question I was going to aim towards you, which is really how can, and you touched on it a little bit in your opening remarks, which is how can organizations and leaders balance the benefits of AI with the need to foster inclusivity, for example?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Yeah, I think that the topic of bias and fairness and discrimination, especially against marginalized groups, is one we have to be really aware of. As you say, in data sets all around the world and online, there is just inherent bias in the data. So there are techniques that we can adopt within the model development lifecycle. So, you know, algorithmic bias and audits are one particular tool, and they come in different varieties and different sort of levels of detail. But I think implementing them within the model development lifecycle is really, really important. And there are metrics that can be employed for that. There are group fairness metrics like equality of odds and disparate parity, and there's a whole list of those. There's counterfactual fairness, there's individual fairness. So there are routines that are available as packages that can be installed in model development platforms to surface metrics that talk about the differences in those metrics, and will allow model risk teams to really look at that. And if so, maybe even an ethics board to actually look at that and say, well, look, do we feel comfortable that actually there is discrimination in our models? And then make an informed decision. Because there is a fine balancing act. For responsible lending, we tend to use credit risk scoring as one of the inputs. There is a possibility that by trying to be fair to all groups, you could actually irresponsibly lend to some groups or some individuals that actually don't deserve it. So group fairness, although in spirit it's a really good thing to aim for, in practice it can actually be quite detrimental. So balancing the need for inclusivity with responsible banking practices is actually quite difficult, made even more difficult by the fact that sensitive characteristics, things like ethnicity, gender, sex, etc., are not part of the algorithms, and they're not the features that are allowed in a model. So I think that's an ongoing problem, and it's emerging in terms of best practices for dealing with that. And I think, look, I mentioned an ethics AI board, and I can talk about that more maybe on a later question. But I think it's really important to have humans look at those metrics and then make decisions. It's not an automated decision whereby you get an algorithm to look at your bias metrics and go, we're good or we're bad. I don't think it's binary. The decisions around fairness, I think, are best arrived at through discussion, primarily through an ethics board or an ethics panel, but certainly with some senior oversight on that whole process, because there are conflicting and overlapping values that get involved when we talk about fairness, and we don't all have an agreed definition of fairness.
I think that's a really important point. Giles, I see you put your hand up to comment on that, and I'll you as well.
Well, I wanted to highlight the real positive that Paul's bringing out there about how AI can help us track any bias. Because as we all know, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was no bias or discrimination when we didn't have AI. So, you know, we have to accept actually that we're in a better position to track these things now. In the 1970s, someone took a decision in an office and nobody ever found out about the bias or discrimination in that decision. Now this can be tracked, measured, and actions can be taken. So there's a huge positive in here about AI for some of these uses. You know, we assume the bias is coming out of nowhere. We all know it comes from somewhere. And it's certainly not created by the AI itself in the first instance.
I think that's a very important point. But the next question I was going to aim towards yourself, Giles, is really coming back to the feature that I wrote all those years ago on the banker, which is really about creating that framework for ethical use or responsible use of AI. You know, how can leaders in the financial sectors create that framework that aligns with the values of professionalism? And you did touch on it a little bit in your initial comments, but
yeah, I think without going into the range of actual technically recognized frameworks that are available to work with, such as human-centered design, value-centered design, I was going to first touch upon what those values of professionalism are, because I think we all talk about professionalism a lot and we all talk about ethics a lot. But I think it's quite interesting when you start to dig into it. You know, when I work with people, one of the questions I always ask, okay, what's integrity and how do you differentiate that from honesty? Because most people's first answer will be, well, it's like honesty. So I think there's some really interesting questions to explore about what we mean by some of this. And it actually links to some of the things we said earlier. So, you know, for a professional to be a professional, you need responsibility. And then we have to ask, okay, so what's responsibility? The responsibility has three factors to it. You need to have your capacity to be able to act. You need to have an ability to influence the outcome. If you can't influence the outcome, arguably, in most cases, you won't be seen to have responsibility. But critically, you also need to have the knowledge. And this ties into something Paul was saying earlier. We can't expect a simple evolution here without training, without qualifications, without skills being developed. And so for me, to act effectively as organizations and to build that culture, we need that professional knowledge and we need those professional skills, because whatever the framework you have, without a core understanding of banking and without a core understanding of the purpose of a bank, you'll always struggle to interact with any ethical framework. And so for me, there's several frameworks out there that you can work with, but it gets back to that point that Paul made. It's who's interacting with those frameworks, how are you interacting with them? You know, ethics committees, for example, do you have places to discuss these issues so you can share values? I always find it fascinating that actually when you start having those meetings, most people broadly agree on the outcome. They often get to it in a different way when they have those sort of discussions about what should happen here, what's right, what's wrong. And we also need to consider that, again, in the real world, there's no one simple answer. I'll go back actually to the self-driving car business. We were often quoted in examples of ethical AI. So should the car drive into the old person or the young child? Well, nobody knows the answer to that in our real world anyway. So why on earth do we think AI will ever be able to answer that question for us? It's a highly complex ethical question that probably has no correct answer to it. And I think we need to just be realistic about what we can achieve here. You know, AI is a fantastic tool when it works with and alongside people. But let's not try and reinvent it as this godlike intelligence that has the answers to everything we ever needed to know. I see Paul's got his hand up.
Yeah, I know, Paul put his hand up, but I
Yeah.
also wanted to bring Hussam in just a second. Hussam, I don't know if you want to comment on, you know, where we're going in terms of that framework. And then, of course, I'll bring Paul in as well.
I think Giles made a very, very good point there. And I think the creating a godlike entity there where the truth has been surrendered by us to that entity, AI. We saw glimpses of that when a few years ago, everything was Googled. Whatever we wanted, whatever truth we wanted, we will Google it. And then Google became the source of everything. Now we have AI, you know, ChatGPT. I know friends who chat to ChatGPT regularly just because they can. And the problem here is, you know, since the invention, I guess, of I call it invention of writing and then calculating and then calculators, we always surrender some of our abilities and some of our skills as humans to those new inventions. AI now, I mean, what are we going to surrender to AI? Certain processes, abilities, or are we also going to surrender our understanding of what ethics and morality is? That's an area where, you know, is very dangerous, because how do you challenge that? You know, we saw this going back to Google. If you want to search for something and Google gives you certain answers, and we saw this in some cases, there are examples of how Google was used to manipulate sources of truth. I mean, where do you go after that? Some people will just stop at the first page of whatever Google gives them and don't go any further. Same with AI. They will search, they will ask ChatGPT or whoever, and they will give them an answer, and that will be the source of truth. And that's a very, very dangerous point, that we surrender that ability to technology, and without having the adequate frameworks, the adequate governance structure around it, the adequate regulation. And some people may not like the word regulation, but what else do we do? Do we stop regulating things? And you know, this brings the issue of leadership. Now, is leadership in those financial institutions also an individual? I've seen in banks, in my previous lives in different parts of the world, where the chairman of a bank will decide individually that, you know, this is the direction we're going to, and it's ethical, it's climate related, and it's you know, SDG focused, and everyone just agreed and moved on. Now, is this the kind of leadership that we are seeking? I don't think so. I think leadership in institutions has to also be beyond a personal leadership. It has to be the frameworks, the committees, the leadership teams, the leadership structure, the governance framework, the accountability, the transparency, and the ability also to seek feedback, to decide continuously what is material to that institution, listening to employees, to staff, to customers, to regulators, to the stakeholders. And I think this is a very, very crucial area to keep in mind, that, you know, the AI and the new development, as exciting as they are and as cute as they are in terms of giving us immediate answers and writes us immediate essays, they could be dangerous also in terms of their not understanding their limited abilities when it comes to morality and ethics.
Those are very good points. Paul, I'll bring you in. Great,
thank you, Joy. It's a really wide-ranging and really interesting conversation. I just want to pick up on a couple of the points that Giles and Hussam have made. I think there's a really, really important need, not just within organisations, but within society, to let people know that actually generative AI is just predicting tokens based on frequency of past occurrences. That there isn't an essence of intelligence in there. And I think that's such an important message, and I'm glad to hear it sometimes. but I think it's really important. Most people, I think, are tempted to think there really is some intelligence in this thing, and there really isn't, right? It really quite literally is just that. It's taking a broad brush approach to all of the text on the internet and predicting sequence of words. And unfortunately, it's so good at that, and it's so plausible that people ordain it with certain things that it hasn't got. So I think that's just number one. You know, I repeat that quite a lot, but I think it's important. The other point that Hassan mentioned really relates to human agency, right? There are certain things that we do as humans that we should not expect machines to do. You know, there should be a line there drawn where we say, no, we will not cede a computer program to do or tell us certain things. I think we really have to bear that in mind. That's part of the kind of what was behind the EU's AI Act. So I think the 2 points there about education and human agency, for me, I feel really passionate about them. And I think finally we mentioned ethics. We talked about ethics, and ethics is a bit of a fuzzy word, isn't it? It's a bit of philosophy in there, and people often say, what does it really mean? And of course, ethics doesn't have a right or wrong, right? That's why ethics is ethics. So we like to think, and I certainly like to talk about responsible AI. And I'm head of responsible AI, and I was really glad that I could choose that as part of my function and role, because I think responsibility for organizations is the key here. You know, we are responsible for the systems that we build. So it removes the kind of the focus on ethics and whether you're ethical, more towards, do you take responsibility for the systems that you put out, either against colleagues within your organization or customer facing. So responsibility and then accountability come from that as well. And we can explore that, but I think that's a very important point to get across. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Hassam, I was going to point the next question to you, which is really about, and you touched on it in terms of that leadership. You know, how can financial organizations foster a culture of ethical leadership at all levels? And again, that's just not the top executives, but it's going throughout the whole organization.
Thank you. I think I'll emphasize the importance of the middle management in here, because you could have the top management, the board of directors, the executives, the C-suite, having a certain vision, and then you will have the frontliners, and you'll have the actual customer-facing staff, and then the connection between both the top and bottom, the middle management, is actually where a lot of the responsibility in terms of conveying the message, making sure that everything is delivered, is extremely important. Leading by example, I think Giles mentioned that, leading by example, and you know, staff to see that, you know, this is not something we do in order to gain more customers or more, even though we are a commercial organization. And then this is another challenge. I take it back to the earlier question. One of the challenges is, how do you separate between what is the prime objective of the company, which is commercial aspects, and also the expectations from society, from many other stakeholders, that you will do it the right way. That balance also lies between what the senior leadership of the organization, even with the right frameworks, with the right governance and committees, and who faces the clients on the ground. Making that balance is an important part of leadership. Every employee has to feel that sense of leadership. Leadership is not just, as I mentioned, it's not just an individual, but an institutional. How do we get everyone in the organization to feel that they are a leader in their own space? They can make the influence, they can make the change, they can make the positive aspects. How do they feel that they are contributing positively? How do they feel? Training, unfortunately, you know, it has become a very mundane and very an exercise that we do in order to just move on. And what do you do then beyond training? How do you instill this culture of, I am also a leader in my own department, in my own junior role? And that's, I think, you know, only organizations that foster a good culture of leadership will be able to transcend that ethical leadership from the top to the bottom. So I think beyond training is the culture of the organization, that everyone is responsible, everyone is a leader in their own space, everyone has the ability to voice their opinion, their concerns, and everyone is heard, and everyone is part of the decision making. Somehow organizations have to develop mechanisms to do that. And I think this is, yes, training is important, investment in training is important, allowing employees to participate in external and internal training, that's a given. But the culture of everyone is a leader in their own sphere of influence is, I think, is a very, very important aspect of an organization that believes in leadership, and an organization that leads by example.
Excellent. I think that's really interesting. And Paul, the next question, and you might want to comment on some of what Hussam has said, but the next question I was going to ask is really about how do you take that individual responsibility and sort of bring together that regulatory framework that's being developed to really ensure that ethical decision making is happening in banking?
Yeah, so bringing those two together to make sure ethical decision making's happening, I think governance and compliance tools do help, and for AI systems, you know, I think though we can leverage those. So something that says, okay, driven by policies, so policies across banks, whether it's, you know, operational, security, model risk, and so on. I think those policies have to be uplifted to ensure that the requirements for AI are put into those policies. And banks have quite a mature policy framework and organizations around that govern how policies are created and then how they're acted upon. So I think it's really important that we write the requirements for ethical AI into policies. Now they can be driven clearly by things like the EU AI Act that says, you know, you must do certain things. They can be driven also by an organization's own AI ethics code, code of conduct. So, you know, we have one at NatWest. When I was at Lloyd's, we had one there. So as long as those kind of principles, legislative requirements, and our appetite makes its way into policies, we can then leverage the governance that we have in enterprise risk management to make sure that they're complied with. And I mentioned at the beginning of this that I think platforms, like a governance platform for that, would be very effective. And we can leverage those. There are some fairly new technology companies that have them, but some of the more established technology players like IBM, for example, do have those as well. I'm not particularly pushing IBM, I'm just mentioning it as an example. But they enforce compliance to policies through a platform that's auditable, that has role-based access, and really employing that and connecting it to your model development lifecycle and your model development platforms, so that the control requirements that come from governance that says, for example, for a credit lending application, it must be fair. That would be a control requirement that can be embedded in the platform, driven by policy. And then if that's connected to a model development platform, that platform can surface metrics, I mentioned metrics earlier, that measure that particular requirement. And then that enables us to define things like thresholds that must be established and met. And then the model development platforms can surface some of those. But the really important thing is all of that is tracked. So the progress towards it, the data sets used, the version of the model used, the heritage of the model, the integrity of the training data sets, the features in the training data sets, to be able to capture snapshots of that through time, and to be able to demonstrate that in the whole of the model development lifecycle, the development team were employing best practice, that the risk function was appropriately providing oversight over that process, and that the actual governance requirements for ethical AI are met, can be surfaced all within that platform. And that enables the bank to bring all of their AI models together in one platform and provide management reporting, kind of a portfolio dashboard, if you will, of the landscape of AI systems, where they are in the development lifecycle, which ones have failed, which ones did we not put into production, because here we had some control requirements driven by policy and we couldn't meet them. Therefore, we didn't put that into production. I think that kind of dashboard or portfolio view is so important. And it's so important not only for the executives to have a a real good handle on what's happening, but also for when we have conversations with regulators to say, actually, look, this is how we manage that entire landscape. So some of those are big exercises, and certainly in NatWest, we've got a program that's in flight to implement bank-wide governance around AI. So I think there are a number of points there, but that's really bringing together your policies with individual actions from risk management right the way through to model developers.
Excellent. So it's definitely that interdisciplinary approach as well, though, isn't it? Bringing people together. I see Giles has put up his hand. So Giles?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Paul something because it really interests me. Obviously the regulator tends to take this view of individual responsibility, and we see that, you know, across a lot of regulation. But with the highly complex nature of AI in the world you're working in across all your, well, I won't get into any more detail, but it's so hugely complex and across organizations. Do you see challenges between that requirement for individual responsibility vis-a-vis the fact that this is simply highly complex with a whole lot of organizations, individuals involved in your sort of chain of delivery?
I think, look, the individual responsibility and roles, there can always be a tendency to getting teams to come together to have the same level of understanding. You know, that can be a challenge, absolutely. And raising awareness of things like bias and where it emanates from is quite a nuance, right? It's yes, there is bias in historical data. People get that. But there's bias that can arise throughout the model development lifecycle, as I'm sure you're aware, in terms of how we label data sets, whether the holdout data set is representative of the deployed population, whether the holdout data set is compliant, has the same representation as a training data set. There's a whole myriad of issues that go on. And I think they're not always clear to people, right? And educating development teams to spot those things and understand that they need to look for them in the first place. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. But so that's how, and I mentioned the code of conduct. So I think establishing a data and AI ethics code of conduct is really important. It's quite easy to write them out as lines of text, right? We will be responsible. We will not treat people unfairly. But the practice of implementing the controls and compliance with that is actually really, really challenging. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. And I don't think you find many organizations that tell you exactly how they do it on their external website, even though they'll give you their code of conduct. It becomes a much more complex thing. And even more so, if we move from predictive AI, as you know, to generative AI, it becomes a much, much tougher problem because we don't have control over the pre-training data sets. So it's a tough one.
Excellent. All right. I just want to remind the audience that we are going to go to questions from the audience in a few minutes. But I have a couple more questions that I'm going to pose to the panel, and then we'll open it up. So please, if you send any questions through that you have for this, our brilliant panelists, and also please say which organization you're from, just so that we know as well. But my next question was to come back maybe on Hassan's point around sort of training, etc. And Giles, I was going to ask you, how can leadership really ensure that the ongoing education and professional development of staff are aligned with the ethical use of technology, whether that's AI or other technologies, sort of coming back to where we started at the beginning?
Well, clearly, whilst this is an opportunity for a shameless plug for the Chartered Banker Institute's new certificate in AI and digital banking, it is quite an interesting area to explore, particularly after Hassan's comments about how training can be mundane, because I think that's absolutely true. I think for me, training never really stands alone, nor does the qualification stand alone. It's about how you embed that in the organization. It's about how you embed it actually as part of a longer career journey. I mean, I always say many of the qualifications I've taken 20 years ago are things that are some of the most useful to me now, but I certainly didn't realize it at the time. So I think, you need to be really clear on what you want to achieve here. I'd also refer back to the last session where we were talking about, obviously the number of people who have jobs that, they didn't even know existed, etc. So we need to be training people with skills for the future. We need to be ensuring that people see whatever happens, whatever roles they end up in, that ethics is a core central feature. I always find it quite interesting that, you don't get taught ethics at school. You don't get taught ethics in most university courses. It's always seen as a bit of an add-on. You're somehow meant to know that intuitively, you know the difference between right and wrong. And actually, there's a lot of really interesting research from the world of moral psychology that we actually typically intuitively come up with a decision straight away about what's right or wrong, and then we argue ourselves into a position that yes, I'm actually right. So we think we've got all these great frameworks for helping us decide, but actually, it's just what comes into our mind first, and then we stick to it. That's what the moral psychology and science suggests. I'm not suggesting people should follow this for a minute. So I mean, I think a lot of it is about, education that really makes people think, that makes them ask questions, that makes them challenge. There is a baseline of knowledge required, but actually the reality is you need people to be taking serious professional qualifications that ask them to actually really think, to consider positions, to consider their position, to actually understand who they are and where their values come from and what their values align with. Because it's a bit like what Paul said yesterday, ethics is this sort of vague thing. And it's sort of, the more, therefore, you can have thought about it in advance in maybe an educational setting, at least then you know the sort of challenges that you're considering, that you're thinking through. So I do think, good, well-structured, challenging education from a professional body is the way to help develop that. And also that then leads into professional membership and continuing professional development, having peer groups with whom you can discuss some of these challenges. It gets back really as well to those points about, having an ethics committee, etc. So much of this stuff comes out in the discussion and understanding each other's positions, understanding each other's values, that actually helps us to build that education. So the last thing you want to do really is to be sort of, just pushing people through compulsory training. There's a lot to be thought about serious engagement with how you are going to think and develop in these areas.
Excellent. And Sam, do you want to add anything in
No,
terms of how?
I mean, I echo what Giles said. Training is I mean, ethics and ethical and is something that philosophers debated for thousands of years, and it's not going to come to banking and be finally resolved and be clear and very definitive, and everyone knows what ethical banking is, and let's do it ethically. And so I mean, if I had a choice, I would remove the word ethics and ethical from banking and make it responsible or something else. Probably easier to manage, easier to also remove. Everyone has their own reference for what is ethical. Some people take it from their faith, from their belief, from their culture, from their background, and then you bring this into the world of business and commerce, and it becomes slightly problematic. I'll always advocate responsible banking, sustainable, perhaps, transparent. How do you then get that trained? And again, it starts with finding a reason. Staff need to find that this is something they do because this is what helps them do better, achieve better, become better. And it's a feeling. It's something that the organization and the top tier of management of the organization have to mean it. It has to be built in. It has to be something that they practice themselves, and it has to be something that it's not vague. It's not, and it will always evolve. It's open to discussion. It's open to revision. So I think this is it. I mean, the training there will always be training, and there will always be a module there, probably mandatory, that says, ethical banking, or, which is fine. Will that achieve the objective and the intention? Maybe not, or maybe yes. We can't. I mean, again, we're getting into philosophy now and saying whether it's a yes or no, and what's the logic there. And I would just say that leading by example from the top to the middle management is very crucial. And organizations that lead by example, that have listening management and listening leadership, they will end up achieving better than those other organizations where there is no transparency.
Excellent. And Paul, I saw you put your hand up, so we'll take you before we move to questions from the audience, which are coming in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joy. And I won't be too long because I think we're slightly running over. Joy, I just wanted to mention off the comments from Giles and Hassan that we shouldn't lose sight of how AI could be leveraged for things like the UN Sustainability Development Goals, right? Things like that. AI can, if deployed really well, have great benefits. And we see that in healthcare from some of the work that DeepMind have done with AlphaFold. We see that partly for climate, in fact, as well. For education, so personalized education capability that can be dispersed globally to anyone with a smartphone, to people in countries that don't have a very good or a very deep AI infrastructure or technology infrastructure. So I think we shouldn't forget that actually to advance ethical practices using AI is actually really, really possible. And it reads across to Giles's earlier point that actually we can surface bias that we wouldn't have talked about 20 years ago, and we can put it center stage and do something about it. So I think not losing sight of the fact that AI can be really, really beneficial for us is important. And I think my final point was we talked about ethics and responsible AI, but I like to now think about ethical AI and responsible AI as also being sustainable. So sustainability issues, and there's a big, strong ESG movement, and all banks have a sustainability and climate sort of targets and groups involved in that. And I think embedding how we think of AI and scale AI, especially generative AI, which is really, really compute intensive, I think we need to leverage things like green ops and FinOps practices to ensure that when we deploy AI, it's sustainable across the landscape. And when I say across the landscape, I mean across the organization's landscape, and complies with and feeds into climate disclosures. So sustainable AI, I think, is really, really important.
I think Hassam made some comments around that earlier as well, which is obviously very important. All right, I'm going to move to the questions from the audience. And the first one is from Chaima Azubuki. Yeah, I think so. Thank you for all this engagement. However, I think there's a huge gap in geographical inclusivity as global banking approaches strong handshake with AI. I mean, African banking giants seem to be left behind on this, basically because of a lack of infrastructure and frameworks. And then there's other issues around demographics, literacy levels, and cybersecurity. Does the panel think Africa, with a large population of productive demography, can transit to the implementation of AI and responsible banking within a socially deprived culture and society? And then what is the place of local politics in this transition project, given that banking is at the heart of economic development? And I think that sort of goes back to, SDGs, etc., sustainable development goals. And it's almost inseparable from the regulatory leadership in the nations. So I guess that's sort of the, looking at the regulatory environment, but also the specific situation in Africa. I don't know if anyone wants to take that. It's quite an interesting, it's a fantastic question, actually. Hassam.
Yeah, I'll take this. Just because I had some experience. I was heading the ESG solutions for Middle East and Africa at S&P Global, and I've interacted with a lot of African banks in South Africa, in Namibia, in Kenya, in Nigeria, Madagascar, Mauritius, and there was one problem in almost all of them, and that is the very low quality data, even on paper format. And those banks are expected globally to start reporting on their emissions, on their financed emissions, and their scope 3, and now one way of dealing with that was to use very good, powerful, predictive systems and AI to estimate some of these. And the other alternative was to actually go back to thousands and thousands of SMEs and local businesses and ask them and get all, which is a hugely costly exercise to do. So the other alternative was to use advanced intelligent systems to resolve this dilemma. However, then you have the other issue is how do you make sure that the quality there is better than or as close as it to the truth as it should be. It's a challenge. But you can see where AI can come into play here and provide some kind of solution to areas where there is a gap of 20, 30 years in development of technology, of banking practices, even regulation. So this is one area where I think AI can help in terms of addressing some of these gaps. Whether then this will be accepted globally, whether that's part of I don't think there is really much alternative there. How would the regulators deal with it, and how would the politics and I have no answer there. Perhaps some of the other panelists may want to add there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that, Hassam. I was going to move on to the next question unless someone else wants to comment on that. But the next question was from Paddy Sheikh, and it's addressed to you, Giles, which is really following on from some of your comments. Can regulators require or business benefit from a senior managers and certificate regime (SM&CR) post, which specifically focuses on AI integration in business? Do you think that's a good idea?
Sorry, could you repeat the start of the question?
Yeah, so can regulators require or business benefit from an SM&CR post, which specifically focuses on AI integration in business?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it sort of relates to the question I asked Paul about, the interaction between that notion of individual responsibility versus the complexity within the organization. I think it's quite a hard question to answer from outside a bank, because it's very easy to say yes, of course it would, but then looking at the maps of responsibility within organizations, you might find that that's not going to be consistent with where responsibilities lie. So to that end, I see Paul's got his hand up, so I'll hand over.
All right, Grand Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, look, it is a really good question. I'm going to try and give my thoughts on it, but not with reference to the senior management regime, but in a different way. I think it's worthwhile looking at whether there should be certain mandatory qualifications for data scientists and machine learning engineers who are working on models that affect people. So, credit lending, insurance underwriting. So those kind of models, predictive AI, actually, that make decisions that affect people's lives. The EU AI Act talks a lot about that kind of thing. I think it's worthwhile exploring whether model developers should meet some kind of qualification that maybe has been mandated by the IEEE or maybe a standards organization. But I think it's worthwhile looking at that because as I found in the banks I've worked in, driving culture and change within the organization, we do it, we build courses, we deploy them, we work with our people to push that forward. But I think we could all do with a bit of help. We could all do with a bit of help on that. So I support exploring it as an idea. Whether or not it's part of the senior management certificational regime, I'll defer. I think there are maybe other things that could be looked at. But that's my thought on formal qualifications, at least.
Excellent. Okay, great. And just to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box. It's down on the sort of right-hand side of your screen. And then we're going to move to a few that have come through otherwise. So one of the questions that have come through is, with so many rapid changes in technology, is it practical for leaders to keep up with every advancement? If not, what safeguards can be put in place to maintain an ethical approach? Who would like to take that question? Paul, you still have your hand up.
Yeah, it's look, a rapidly evolving and changing landscape. So I think it's prudent for banks and maybe any organization is not to be too eager to deploy the latest, greatest technology, right? At least not in customer-facing environments, definitely not. So I think taking a prudent, kind of calibrated approach maybe could be, look, there is a new technology. Let's bring it internally into a sandboxed environment and let's experiment with it. Let's put some of our data into it and see how it behaves, but in a very controlled, experimental environment to see actually whether it's kind of got legs. And I think that should definitely be the first port of call. And that should involve data scientists, risk people, looking at the results of that, and really take a really hard look at whether or not we want to take it any further at this stage at all. I'm quite lucky that the industry I work in is regulated, and I think that's a really good thing. I think we affect people on the street, society. We should be regulated, and we shouldn't actually be deploying the latest, greatest technology. Which, let's face it, all of generative AI is nascent and early, and it's really early in its lifetime. And I think taking that calibrated approach is for me. There's no other option.
Excellent. And Hassam?
Yeah, I think when you talk about technology in banking, banks have their core banking system, which is where credit is generated and processed, and and this core banking system in most banks is archaic. It's very old. It's very difficult to upgrade. It's very difficult to move. It's very difficult to replace. So to keep up with technology when it comes to core banking is a big challenge, and it's probably a hugely costly exercise, if ever. However, banks should start to look to beyond banking partnerships. And this is definitely something we are looking at Santander here. We developing platforms where we interact with SMEs and offer latest technology solutions. We offer partnerships with other technology providers. So there are ways around it, but we have to make that distinction between the core banking system and also the keeping up with the new advances in IT and technology and AI to provide access and facilitate access to solutions.
Excellent. All right, I think we have one more time for one more question from the audience, and then I was going to do a roundup question. And the question that's come through is really, how do leaders prioritize ethical culture building when there is also pressure to compete and innovate at speed? And I think we've touched on that throughout the panel, but it's quite good to sort of reiterate, how can you balance those things? To me, they should, go hand in hand, actually. Giles, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about the culture you have, and it's all about at what point you're asking those ethical questions and making sure you're constantly aware of it's not an add-on for halfway through the process. It's something you need to consider at the outset. We've seen so many organizations come unstuck over innovation gone wrong for whichever reason. I just think by the time you're innovating, if you're only starting to think about your engagement with ethics and values at that point, you've left it too long. It's too late. But I'd also reiterate that this is not a new problem. We've always had to develop and evolve our companies and our organizations and our corporations. And typically, looking back over history, those which have failed to maintain an ethical stance have come asunder in the past. So it's always going to be challenging, but that's where you need thoughtful professional bankers who will challenge and consider what they're dealing with.
Excellent. And Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Unless I misheard the question, I think this one was about balancing the need for ethics, which might hinder innovation or competitiveness. I kind of want to reframe that question, actually, because I don't think we should think of it as something ethics slows something down or ethics hinders competitiveness. I think actually the opposite. I think it promotes doing the right thing. And in the long term, doing the right thing is sustainable. So putting in controls around ethical controls, let's put it that way, around building models that are deployed and affect people. If you do that right and fairly, then you've got a much more sustainable footing for your business. So I take a slightly different view. It's a bit like a question that says, oh, too much legislation hinders innovation. Again, I kind of disagree with that, and primarily for the same reason. In fact, it gives you certainty around what you can and can't do, which I think is a better long-term solution. So maybe, from my point of view, if I talk about sustainability, it's making sure that whatever we deploy has a longer-term good effect. And you might sacrifice this year's P&L, but you're building a better foundation, not only for the business, but actually also for people. Right, and at the end of it, that's so important.
I just add in there, please, quickly, and that's why I think that point that was made earlier, I think by Paul and Sam, that we need to think of ethics in terms of sustainability and responsibility rather than just as ethics. An ethical decision de facto has to be sustainable. So, you know, it is about that being in it for the long game, and that therefore will lead to those outcomes. So it sometimes our terms affect how we think about these things.
Yeah.
Excellent. Sam, did you want to join in or add any other comments?
No, I agree. I agree with my colleagues there, and I think, you know, sometimes having the right mechanisms to make the distinction between what is right and what is not right from a banking perspective I think there are enough mechanisms now to make that decision. However, in a changing world where the requirements and the expectations of the market are changing rapidly, geopolitics, environment, climate risks, all of this, there needs to be kind of a mechanism that keeps banking executives aware and enabled to make those right decisions. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, I'm just going to wrap up. We only have 2 minutes left, so it's about a 30-second answer from each of the panelists. The last question I have is sort of what is your advice to financial institutions, because obviously we have a global audience looking to start their AI journey. What do you think is the first step that they need to look at? So maybe I'll start with Paul.
Thank you, Joey.
Yeah, I know. Like, throw me in the deep end.
Appoint a responsible AI officer to your organization to build a small team of experts to do all of the things we've talked about, which is about culture, education, training, build an ethics board, and put in governance around ethics and governance. And that's a really, really big thing to do. But I think you need to make one person the person that leads all of that activity. Excellent.
And Hassan?
I would just say, I was just checking whether I'm on mute, to make sure that you embrace AI and not to be scared of AI, as we normally humans are apprehensive when it comes to new changes, and also to have the right mechanisms in place and the right controls to make sure that humans are on top of it.
Excellent. And Giles?
Yeah, remember you're professional bankers. Those values don't change. Those values you take with you, what you'll be doing, what you'll be engaging with will change considerably, but you're still a professional banker at the heart of all that.
Excellent. All right. Well, I just want to thank Sam, Paul, and Giles for your brilliant insights. And also I want to thank the audience for your great questions and participation. And thanks for joining us for day 2 of the Annual Banking Conference 2024. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.